My ex-husband committed suicide. After his death, his diary was accidentally seen by me, and I learned the truth about his divorce from me. It turned out that there was no Junior at all, no cheating, just his short and fragmented life. In an accident, I went back 15 years and met 11-year-old Malcolm Susan again. When it was still too late, I chose to stand in front of him who was weak and helpless, and told him, "Don't be afraid, I will protect you." Less than a year after the divorce, her ex-husband Malcolm Susan committed suicide. I received a call from home from a man, who said he was a police officer, who said that Malcolm Susan had died, and had committed suicide by jumping into the sea, and that I had been asked to go back to my country, and claim his body. Suicide by jumping into the sea. How can it be? I taught him how to swim, not to mention, he paid alimony to my card yesterday. It's only been a day and you're dead. Thinking it was another international joke, I replied, "Isn't he married again? If you don't look for his current wife, why are you looking for me, my ex-wife?" On the other end of the phone, after reporting his unit and the police number to confirm with me, he added, "Mr. Malcolm Susan is not married. You are the only contact person we can find for Malcolm Susan." Realizing that it was true, my tears flowed violently, and the whole person seemed to have been struck by lightning. And after that, I couldn't hear what the police said. Malcolm Susan and I were married for 4 years, and after we found out he was cheating, we divorced peacefully. He took the initiative to leave the house, but I refused, left him a house, took only half of the family's savings, and went to Germany. He had no contact with me, except that he would pay me every month. I caught a plane overnight and flew back to China in a daze, only to see a giant who had become a giant and had been unrecognizable. Malcolm Susan, swollen and festering from the sea, barely recognizable only by the fact that he had our wedding ring in his hand. After burying Malcolm Susan, my lawyer, Becca Lick, approached me and handed over Malcolm Susan's cat to me. This cat is Malcolm Susan's 21st birthday, and I gave him a birthday present. Malcolm Susan took the cat before committing suicide. Ask Becca Lick to help you raise it for a few days, but it doesn't know that its owner is no longer there. Becca Lick said that Malcolm Susan left me a house and a deposit of $730,000, which he compensated me. And these, almost all of him. I asked Becca Lick, "Why did Malcolm Susan kill herself?" Becca Lick said, "Dissociative conversion disorder, long-term accumulation of depression out of control." I don't believe it. Malcolm Susan is clearly such a sane person. What can push him step by step to death? Becca Lick grimaced. "I don't know if I'm doing it right, but I think you're entitled to know the truth." He handed me a USB flash drive. "You may not know that you are abroad, but the video in this USB flash drive has been maliciously spread on the internet in the past year. It was also posted on the forum of the university where Malcolm Susan worked, and he lost his job because of it. And then Malcolm Susan's dissociative conversion disorder recurred, which may have been one of the reasons for Mr. Malcolm Susan's suicide." In the USB flash drive, there are hundreds of videos of 12-year-old Malcolm Susan being violated and bullied, in which he is almost desperate and helpless. Just one video made me feel extremely tormented, and a deep sense of powerlessness spread to all my limbs. And there was a dense density in an instant. The numb needle stabbed at me violently, and all my internal organs were working violently. I can't believe how much my precious husband should have hurt when he was treated so cruelly. With tears in my eyes and trembling, I pointed to the abuser in the video and asked Becca Lick, "Who is he? Did he spread the video too?" Becca Lick, "His name is Ian Barney. He is Malcolm Susan's stepfather, and he started his love for Malcolm Susan after his mother died of cancer. A year-long assault, after which Malcolm Susan was thrown at a welfare home, and threatened with these videos to demand from him every year. It requires a lot of money. Until a year ago, when Ian Barney was in debt for gambling, the lion opened his mouth and demanded $2 million from Malcolm Susan. Rejected by Malcolm Susan, Later, Ian Barney was angry and posted the video on the internet, and then smuggled and fled abroad, where he has not been caught. I listened to all this silently, and my heart was like a knife. He endured so much alone when I didn't know it. Later, I found Malcolm Sussan's diary, which was densely packed with days and nights of torture and him, countless nightmares that are hard to break free from. His parents, teachers, classmates, friends, no one treated him well, and their insults became a lingering shadow for Malcolm Sussan's life. But he regarded me as the only light in his hopeless life, the last straw in his sad life. His short 26 years came to an abrupt end. But he said, "I'm finally free." He said, "The only thing I'm sorry for is my wife." After reading all the diaries, I burst into tears. I should have found out sooner. I shouldn't have left him alone to face this. Our wedding photo still hangs on the wall in the room. Looking at his lips slightly raised as he looks at me, I suddenly remembered my freshman year, the second year after my fierce pursuit of him, and I sat with him, in a window seat in the corner of the library. He reads books. I read him. He raised his eyes to look at me, his voice soft and bitter. "Olga Pater, am I really worthy of your affection? You don't know me." And what did I say at the time? I leaned close to him, and whispered in his ear, "Of course you deserve it. You deserve the best in the world." His face was pale and red, and his already pale lips were a little red from his bite, and he only looked at me deeply, as if he had made a big decision. "Olga Pater, I agree." I wandered and immersed myself in his beautiful amber eyes. Agree with what? When I reacted, I was so surprised that I almost jumped. "Really?" Before he could finish speaking, his slender hand covered his mouth, and he was afraid that I would be so happy that I ran around the library. I took his hand away and kissed him on the lips. His face was red to the back of his ear, as if he could drip blood. I was proud and kissed him on the face again. "You're my boyfriend, and you're afraid of me kissing you." I thought that in my relationship with him, I was the one who was passive. But in the diary, he said, "Olga Pater, it's good you're here." I walked alone, thinking that I would fall into the darkness forever. But you came to me with a lamp, wanting to take my hand, and go to a brighter place. Every moment I spend with you is like I stole it. So I am walking on thin ice, afraid that you will not love me, that you will love me too much, that you will know my tattered past, that you will be disgusted with me. I hugged the diary and cried. It turned out that even the cheating I thought was a stupid way he came up with in order to divorce me. I looked at the diary of Malcolm Sussan's life over and over again, and I didn't know when I fell asleep. In my dream, a voice asked me, "Do you want to see him again?" Then my consciousness cleared up. When I opened my eyes again, I was back 15 years ago. At that time, I was 12, he was 11, and everything was still in time. Originally, I was supposed to transfer to another school in the second half of my senior year at the age of 17 and become a table with Malcolm Sussan at my new school. But now, the time has to be brought forward. At my insistence, my parents finally agreed to transfer to the school where Malcolm Sussan was in junior high school, and I met him 5 years earlier, Shore Maple Middle School, Junior 1 class. I stood on the podium and introduced myself to the class. "My name is Olga Pater, and I'm new." His eyes kept searching back and forth among the group of children, and finally in the last row near the trash can, he saw a black, thin and short child, dressed in whitewashed clothes, and compared with the surrounding classmates, he was completely like an ugly child, and he was out of place with everyone. But I recognized it at a glance. It was little Malcolm Sussan. My eyes were still moist, and I thought I would never see him again. He was as thin as Malcolm Sussan in his junior year of high school, except that he wasn't as dark and short as he is now. The teacher asked me to choose an empty seat to sit down, and I walked straight towards Malcolm Sussan, and sat down next to him, ignoring the eyes of others. He didn't look at me. He just looked down in the drawer, but after looking for a long time, He didn't find anything. I knew that he was hiding from me, and he was not good at contact with strangers. I greeted him. Hello, my name is Olga Pater. What about you? Hearing me talk to him, he stopped his movements and cringed and said, Malcolm Susan. Malcolm Susan still didn't look at me, and didn't want to say a word to me. I stared only at his thin legs, which were not as thick as my arms, and the 11-year-old boy was the size of an 8 or 9-year-old child, with yellow hair and sunken cheeks. He looks malnourished no matter how you look at it. I feel distress when I look at it. Malcolm Susan's biological father died when Malcolm Susan was 8 years old, and after that, he lived with his remarried mother, who beat and scolded Malcolm Susan when he was a drag oil bottle, and his mother would not stop him, and sometimes the two of them quarreled, and would take it together. Malcolm Susan gasped. After his mother died of cancer, when he was 12 years old, Malcolm Susan was assaulted and bullied by his stepfather, and thrown into a welfare home. These are the things that I learned about Malcolm Susan in his diary after his death, and he never talked about his past in front of me. Since I'm back, Malcolm Susan's life has just begun, and I can't let him repeat it. I have to make everyone who has bullied Malcolm Susan pay the price. And before Malcolm Susan's mother dies, I have to do everything I can to get my parents to adopt him, and get rid of the suffocating life in my diary completely. At breakfast time, everyone took out their breakfast one after another. I opened the breakfast my mom had prepared, a box of sushi, 2 eggs, a carton of milk, and 3 siumai, plus a cake roll. It had to be my mom, who knew everything about my appetite. Nearby, Malcolm Susan pulled out a white plastic bag from his shabby school bag, which contained only a small steamed bun, which apparently did not look like a school breakfast. Malcolm Susan had to work for them in that house, but he couldn't even eat. No wonder it was the age of the long body. Only Malcolm Susan was thin and small. You may have noticed that I was looking at him, and covering it with my arm. Only eat a small steamed bun for breakfast, no matter who it is. When school ends at noon, they will not be so hungry that their chests will be close to their backs. Thinking of this, I can't get angry. I enthusiastically called out to the girl sitting in front of me, This is the sushi my mother made. It tastes good. You can taste it. After dividing 2 pieces of sushi for each of them, he pushed the last 2 pieces of sushi in the box in front of Malcolm Susan. Malcolm Susan, you can taste it too. It's really delicious. Malcolm Susan shook her head. No, I have something to eat. He stubbornly tilted his head to the window. I pushed the box over a little more and grinned. I promise, it's really delicious. Lie to you being a puppy. Malcolm Susan hesitated, but seeing that the 2 girls in front of him were also eating very naturally, he learned to pick up a piece of sushi before putting it in his mouth. Is it delicious? Malcolm Susan nodded. I looked at him expectantly, still with a raised face. It's delicious. Then eat another piece. Malcolm Susan took another piece and ate it, although it took a bit of effort. The good thing was that Malcolm Susan ate 2 sushi and was always able to fill his stomach, but he was still not full after all. I pointed to the steamed bun that Malcolm Susan had covered with his hand. Malcolm Susan, I want to eat your steamed bun. Malcolm Susan looked at me with some confusion, his eyes full of doubt. But when he thought of it, he had eaten my sushi just now, and he couldn't say no, so he only stumbled and said, The steamed bun is a little hard. It's okay, my teeth are good. I simply took it from the plastic bag and took a bite. Ouch, I'll go. It's so hard. It's cold and hard to chew. Those who have lost their conscience are even steamed buns. Noticing that Malcolm Susan was staring at me, I pretended to be calm, ate the steamed buns without changing the color of my face, nibbled on them, and said, It's okay. The steamed buns are okay. Finally finished eating the steamed buns, I pushed the milk and eggs hard. I ate your breakfast. I will exchange eggs and milk with you. Don't shirk. I deliberately accentuated the last 4 words, and Malcolm Susan was afraid of making me unhappy, so I finally accepted it. It was under my supervision that I ate all the eggs and milk. These are the lessons I learned from 17-year-old Malcolm Susan, who, at first, was reluctant to eat the breakfast I had brought, and would barely take a bite unless I was sharing it with a lot of people. This trick really tried for him. After breakfast, he was much better, and sure enough, his wilting appearance was hungry. I was determined to fatten Malcolm Susan. Malcolm Susan sat in the corner of the classroom, and at the end of the day, almost no one spoke to him. I started to take the initiative to find topics. Malcolm Susan, can you lend me an eraser? Malcolm Susan, I'm sleepy. Remember to call me when the teacher comes. At the end of a class, I was able to call Malcolm Susan by name dozens of times, and I would even pull him to chat during recess. He wasn't annoyed. He just listened to me, and reached out to hand me the eraser. When I slept in class, the teacher would come down and pull the corner of my clothes unskillfully, and whisper to wake me up. In the diary, 11-year-old Malcolm Susan is lonely, and her childish pen strokes are somewhat crooked. No one wants to be friends with me. I'm here so I can be his friend. During the break after class, several boys walked to the back of the classroom, holding drink bottles in their hands, stood 2 meters away and began to throw drink bottles into the garbage basket. As soon as I came back from fetching water from outside, I saw a boy named Abel Morley smash the half-left bottle of water on Malcolm Susan, who was sleeping on the table, and then quickly threw out the second and third bottles. Bang, bang, bang. The dull sound of heavy objects slamming into flesh rang out in the classroom. Malcolm Susan couldn't dodge, her mouth hurting so much that her face twisted slightly. The group of boys began to laugh. You are thrown into the garbage basket, not on the garbage. You can't do it, Abel Morley said sarcastically to Malcolm Susan, the one next to the trash can. Pick up the bottle and throw it in the bucket. Malcolm Susan looked at the arrogant group of boys, then at the bottle next to the trash can, and bent down to pick up the drink bottle that had been smashed on him, and throw it into the trash can. Looking at the way Abel Morley and those boys skillfully bullied Malcolm Susan, they must have bullied Malcolm Susan like this often. I was furious, picked up the bottle that had just been filled with water in my hand, and slammed it into Abel Morley's back. Abel Morley was in pain and turned around. Who smashed me? It hurts me to death. You know it hurts, too. It hurts you, and throws it at others. Abel Morley was so angry that he tried to come and hit me, but as soon as his hand was stretched out, I grabbed him firmly, and I slapped him in the face, and a fall over the shoulder knocked him to the ground. At this age, girls will always be taller than boys, and I was sent to learn taekwondo since I was a child, so it was easy to knock him down. Abel Morley was thrown to the ground, clutching his hands, screaming in pain. My hand is broken. It's broken. I crouched down and grabbed the hand he was holding. If it's broken, I'll have to pick up the bottle you threw at me. It hurts. It hurts. It hurts. Let go. I can't pick it up, Abel Morley screamed. Everyone in the class gathered around, and Abel Morley picked up the bottles scattered on the floor, and threw them into the trash. Aren't you going to be able to throw it in? Malcolm Susan's face was visibly shocked when he saw this, and he probably didn't expect me to help him out. Abel Morley was a bully and afraid of the hard, and when he saw that he couldn't beat me, he cried and ran out. The boys who were originally surrounded around were also scattered, for fear that they would be the next to be beaten. Malcolm Susan picked up my water bottle on the floor, wiped it clean and handed it to me. Your water bottle. He will go to the teacher to sue you. It's okay, I'm not afraid. He bullied you first. I saw it. Why did you help me? Malcolm Susan said in a very low voice and with little confidence. He had been bullied for more than a day or two, but no one had ever stepped forward to help him. I looked him in the eye earnestly. Aren't we at the same table? I'll help you as you should. Malcolm Susan, thank you. He said these two words very softly and inaudibly, but I heard them anyway. I secretly rejoiced that the 11-year-old Malcolm Susan was much closer than the 17-year-old Malcolm Susan, and that was good. Sure enough, when it was almost time for school to end, I was called out by the head teacher. Malcolm Susan looked at me with some concern, afraid that I would be reprimanded and punished for what had just happened. I didn't care. I comforted him before leaving. Don't worry, it won't be anything, it really won't be good. My parents don't have anything else, and the ability to protect the Cubs is first class. Inside the office, on one end were Abel Morley and his parents, who had several bandages on their arms, and red slap marks on their faces, and on the other side were my parents, who were hurriedly called by the teacher before they got off work. When my mom saw Abel Morley like that, she took my hand and whispered, "What a grudge, it's all dislocated, and that big slap mark on his face. TSK, you insisted on transferring to another school just to beat him up. Me, is worthy of my mother? The brain circuit is strange." My dad made it clear that he could be responsible for all the medical expenses, and compensate for the mental damages. Hearing that my father was willing to compensate for mental damages, the other parent's face softened slightly, but he still refused to ask me to apologize in public, otherwise he would ask the school to expel me. I don't apologize. But Abel Morley has to apologize to Malcolm Susan in public. He bullied his classmates, otherwise he would call the police and call the police to deal with it. My dad frowned at my words, and turned to look at Abel Morley again. I didn't. Abel Morley began to argue with his parents. I didn't mean to. I just accidentally hit him when I threw the bottle in the trash. My dad didn't say a word and asked the teacher to call up the classroom monitoring to watch. Inside the surveillance, Abel Morley, who is harmless to humans and animals, shows his original ugly face in front of Malcolm Susan, and bullies his classmates. Seeing that the other parent's face was blue and white for a while, they didn't expect that the obedient child they raised was a bully, who shouted to catch a thief at school. They knew they were wrong, and they didn't ask me to apologize. Abel Morley was brought to Malcolm Susan by his parents, and asked him to apologize to Malcolm Susan. Abel Morley reluctantly bowed to Malcolm Susan. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have bullied you. Can you forgive me?" There were people all around, Abel Morley, Abel Morley's parents, and the teacher, all waiting for Malcolm Susan to respond, overwhelming with his unkind gaze. Malcolm Susan just stood. He moved his lips. He wanted to say something but he didn't say it, and there was a little more stubbornness in his eyes. Seeing Malcolm Susan like this, I began to regret why I put Malcolm Susan in such a situation and force him to forgive those who had bullied him. I stepped forward and took Malcolm Susan's hand. "If you don't want to forgive, we won't forgive. Don't force yourself. He did something wrong. It was all his own fault. Then take him away directly, and hang those people in place, in full view of everyone. Abel Morley simply does not deserve forgiveness." I took Malcolm Susan to my parents and introduced them. "Mom, Dad, this is my new friend today. His name is Malcolm Susan." Malcolm Susan was a little surprised that no one had ever introduced him to his parents so formally, especially as a friend. "Hello, Uncle and Aunt." His voice was quiet. "Hey, hello Malcolm Susan." My mom was very keen to invite my various friends home for dinner, and sure enough, she began to warmly invite Malcolm Susan. "Malcolm Susan, come to Auntie's house on weekends, and Auntie will make you something to eat." My dad chimed in, "Yes, come to my house with Olga Pater. You help my uncle urge her to study, so that she doesn't just play all day." Malcolm Susan was a little overwhelmed by my parents' enthusiasm, but politely replied, "Yes, Aunt and Uncle, it's exactly what I want, so that I can have an excuse to take him home for dinner in the future, and I can also cultivate a relationship with my parents first." It's been nearly 3 months since Ian Barney attacked Malcolm Susan in my diary, but I have to plan ahead. After all, Malcolm Susan was in danger for a second more than that demon. After Abel Morley was taught a lesson by me, The people who had bullied Malcolm Susan in the class before did not dare to bully him at will. My relationship with Malcolm Susan has also become much closer. I started bringing an extra breakfast for one person every morning, on the pretext that my mother was preparing too much, and begged Malcolm Susan to share it for me. Malcolm Susan couldn't stand my pleading, and promised to help me eat a bun a day, but refused to do more. In order to keep him fed, I asked my mother to replace the original small buns with vegetable fillings, and oversized buns with meat fillings. When I heard him growl with hunger during the evening self-study, and then tried to drink water to cover up, after class, I took him to the noodle restaurant in front of the school, saying that I was too hungry to eat supper, but I was afraid by myself at night. I ordered 2 bowls of beef noodles at the noodle restaurant, and asked him to eat them with me. He couldn't resist me every time, so he obediently ate with me. After eating, he silently followed me, and even sent me home on the way, until he saw me enter the house, and then he went back himself. Occasionally, the school would give out some free meal tickets, and I said that I didn't like to eat in the cafeteria, and wanted to go home to eat, so I stuffed them all to Malcolm Susan so that he could eat at noon. On weekends, I took him to my house to help me with my homework, and my mother felt sorry for him, so she would always make a big table of delicious food, and force him to come down to eat together. Looking at the occasional smile on Malcolm Susan's face, I always thought about how nice it would be if time could stand still forever. It wasn't until Malcolm Susan came to school with an injury, and stood in front of me that my illusions were completely shattered. A long wound on his jaw was a mark from a sharp weapon. Artificial. Who have you been beaten? I asked him. Nope. You swear you didn't lie to me? Malcolm Susan was silent. He acquiesced to being beaten. It's your stepfather. He nodded. It occurred to me that after my relationship with Malcolm Susan, I had asked him how he got the scar on his jaw. He said that he accidentally fell when he was a child, and it turned out that he lied to me. The scars I have kissed countless times turned out to be the marks left by his domestic violence. I can't imagine that every kiss I give him reminds him of those painful nightmares. Follow me to the hospital. I pulled Malcolm Susan as I left. He sat upright in his chair, and refused to move. Small injury. It will be fine in a few days. No, if you don't deal with it, it will leave a scar in the future. I don't want you to leave a scar, I said seriously. Seeing that he still wouldn't move, I sighed. Forget it. You sit here. I'll come when I go. I went to the infirmary to find the doctor to get the medicine, and come back to help Malcolm Susan treat the wound. It's a little painful. I'll apply it quickly. I use alcohol to help him clean the wound. The wound was very deep, and it would definitely hurt with alcohol, but he didn't hum the whole time, but his eyes were forbearing. I was only distressed, and tears couldn't help but roll in my eyes. When Malcolm Susan saw this, he reached out to wipe my tears. Are you crying for me? I nodded, reaching out and carefully taping the band-aid to the wound. You have to protect yourself. It seemed like no one had ever cared so much about him, Malcolm Susan thought, and he froze for a moment before replying. Okay. One night after self-study class, I took him to dinner again, and when I ordered, I was looking through the menu in my hand, and thinking about what Malcolm Susan liked to order. He sat across from me, looked out the window, and said, Olga Pater, why are you so nice to me? I looked at him, dull for 2 seconds, and before I could think of how to speak, I heard him say again, is it because you pity me? Malcolm Susan's gaze fell on the old scavenger, begging for passers-by outside the shop. Outside the window, the old man was unclawed, and his legs were disabled, so he could only sit on the ground. People passing by were in a hurry, and it was a long, long time before someone stopped, threw the change into the old man's bowl, and hurried away. No one will know when the next person to stop for the old man will come. I chuckled in my heart, followed Malcolm Susan's gaze to see the old scavenger, stopped the movement of my hand, and slowly spoke. No. Am I worthy of being so nice to me? he asked again. At that moment, I almost burst into tears. In a trance, I seemed to see the little Malcolm Susan in front of me, gradually reuniting with the lover in my memory. I looked him in the eye and said solemnly, "You're worth it. You deserve the best in the world. Will you always be my friend?" He said cautiously, as if asking, as if confirm whether the love that he once had been out of reach really fell on him this time, not a dream and charity that would be shattered when he woke up. "Yes," I said in a dumb voice, red-eyed, "I will always be your friend." The nervous look on Malcolm Susan's face vanished, replaced by an unprecedented peace of mind. The darkness of the night, which had been dim since he was young, seemed to reveal a faint glimmer of light. After this life lasted for a while, he was no longer as yellow and thin as he was when he first saw him, but he was still haggard, often distracted in class, and his spirit was often poor. "I know it's because I'm taking care of his terminally ill mother, Gustavi Sally, who was diagnosed with liver cancer a few months ago, and the tumor was all over the liver, which was already advanced." Unwilling to spend money on a worthless woman, his stepfather, Ian Barney, tricked Gustavi Sally into giving up treatment in order to leave money for Ian Barney. As a result, Gustavi Sally missed out on the best treatment. Her condition was not stable and worsened, and she is now in the care of Malcolm Susan alone. But even so, Gustavi Sally still beat and scolded Malcolm Susan, poured all her anger on Malcolm Susan, and blamed Malcolm Susan for all her misfortunes. She never gave Malcolm Susan a single love until she died. When I thought that she was going to die, I felt inexplicable pleasure in my heart. A person like her was not worthy of being a mother at all, let alone alive. At this time, it was only 2 months before her death, but it was too cheap for her to just let her die. So, I picked the day in my diary that my stepfather, Ian Barney, robbed the family of all the money. The photos of Ian Barney sleeping with women outside the home that I specially collected from someone, as well as the records of Ian Barney secretly transferring money to women to raise children outside, were all sent to Gustavi Sally in the name of Ian Barney's Jr. Sent a message to provoke her, "When you die, all this is for me and my son." You stupid woman, why aren't you dead? Let's make this water muddy a little more. Dog Eats Dog is a good show, and I want her to die with 100-fold and 1,000 times the pain and hatred. But on the afternoon of sending the photo, Malcolm Susan did not come to school. I sat in the classroom, looking at the empty seat next to me, inexplicably flustered, and began to recall the contents and details of Malcolm Susan's diary. The diary clearly states that after Malcolm Susan came home from school, he learned that Ian Barney had taken Gustavi Sally's bank card and passbook from his home while Malcolm Susan was away. During the altercation, Gustavi Sally was also injured in the leg by Ian Barney. According to the diary, Malcolm Susan should be in school now, and if he wasn't in school, then anxiety and fear instantly crept over me. Why is it different this time? Why wasn't he in school? I didn't have time to think, so I hurriedly climbed over the wall and walked out of the school gate. There was no car on the road, so I could only run like crazy to Malcolm Susan's house. The fear of the unknown haunting me, and the panic in my heart was at the extreme. I hurried to the door, and when I entered the half-hidden door of his house, a man was crouching on the ground with his back to me, dead, holding Gustavi Sally's neck, which was about to subside. The woman's face flushed red, and she was about to suffocate. Beneath Ian Barney's feet was Malcolm Susan, who was already motionless. Malcolm Susan's back of his head was broken, blood running from the top of his head and staining his face, and the ground below his head was bright red. With red eyes, I picked up the blood-stained hammer and swung it at Ian Barney. Bang dang! Gustavi Sally, who was pinched by him, finally broke free of his hand and gasped for air. My mind was in a state of confusion and I stumbled towards Malcolm Susan. I called him by name, but he didn't respond. He was so hot that he passed out, and his hands were still bleeding out, and I couldn't stop it. I shuddered and took out my phone, called 120 for an ambulance, and then called 110 for the police, and then shouted at the woman who did that. Malcolm Susan blocked the glass bottle and hammer that Ian Barney threw at me for me. The hoarse voice of the messy woman cried, "If it weren't for me, if it wasn't for me, he wouldn't have." I watched in despair as Malcolm Susan lay half dead in blood, crying and calling his name. "Wake up, Malcolm Susan, Malcolm Susan, Malcolm Susan." Hatred drove me to reach out and pick up the hammer on the ground once more, and swing it at the man on the ground. But before I could hit anyone, Gustavi Sally caught it with her hand, and she snatched the hammer I wanted to hit the man's head. "You can't kill him. He was going to kill you and your son," I yelled at her, tears rolling down my eyes. "Save Malcolm Susan first." I looked at Malcolm Susan. "Yes, Malcolm Susan. Save Malcolm Susan first." But the ambulance still hasn't come. In desperation, I picked up Malcolm Susan, covered in blood, and ran through the door. I had just run into the courtyard with Malcolm Susan on my back when there was a loud bang behind me, and a wave of heat rushed towards me, and I realized something and ran desperately out of the heat. Until I ran out of the yard, I turned around and turned back. The woman stood in the firelight and was gradually swallowed up, along with everything around her. In less than 10 seconds, the whole house was instantly reduced to a fire, and the raging fire soared into the sky, burning everything. I carried Malcolm Susan on my back and ran desperately into the open area, never looking back. I collapsed in front of the ambulance that arrived, and the nurses hurriedly put Malcolm Susan into the car, and I followed. As the doctors and nurses struggled to save Malcolm Susan, I shuddered and took out my phone and called the fire alarm again. That woman was crazy, just as crazy as I was. No, crazier than me. The nurses rushed Malcolm Susan to the emergency room. I slumped in my chair, my mind full of Malcolm Susan's blood, and I was overwhelmed by the fear of losing him again. When I saw my parents rushing to the hospital to look for me, I hugged them and cried, "Mom, Malcolm Susan, is he going to die?" My mom touched my head. "No, Malcolm Susan, he's a good boy. He's going to get better." We waited anxiously outside, and when the doctor came out, my father hurriedly stepped forward. "Doctor, how is the child?" "Because it was delivered in time, it was out of danger," the doctor said. When I heard that Malcolm Susan was fine, the boulder in my heart fell completely. Malcolm Susan woke up in the wee hours of the morning. When we woke up and saw that my parents and I were around, we would be ecstatic to see him wake up. And for the first time, Malcolm Susan felt that it was good to be alive. Still apprehensive, I asked Malcolm Susan, "Shouldn't you be going to school at that time? Why are you still at home?" "I'll go back and get the jade pendant my dad left for me, and my dad said he would give it to the most important person. I wanted to give it to you, but I lost it." Malcolm Susan was weak, but still answering my question seriously. With tears streaming down my eyes, I took out a carved jade pendant from my pocket and asked in a trembling voice, "Is this what you said?" "It's something he has been holding tightly in his hand when he was unconscious. This jade pendant. He also gave it to me. I always thought it was just an ordinary hanging ornament. It turned out to be like this." Malcolm Susan nodded. "This is it. It turned out that it was because of me that he was implicated. I returned the jade pendant to him. Keep the important things, and in the future, if you still think I am important, you can give it to me again." Malcolm Susan took the things back. I found out when the police came to the hospital to ask me and Malcolm Susan to take notes. When 119 arrived at the fire scene, the fire was very large, and the firefighters rushed in to save people, only to find that the woman inside had been charred after committing suicide in the kitchen, while the man inside had been burned alive, and the death was extremely miserable. I think of Gustavi Sally. What was she thinking when she dragged Ian Barney to her death? Do you regret for a moment that you never treated your own son well? I don't know all this. And the fire she set out made Malcolm Susan reborn from the ashes. After Malcolm Susan got all right, with his consent, Dad moved with us and left the city completely. It's finally over once and for all. It took me a long time and effort to get Malcolm Susan out of the gloom. My parents have always been very good at raising children. They have enough love and respect, and they go out of their way to care for Malcolm Susan that I sometimes wonder who their real children are. So Malcolm Susan also became a child who grew up in love. We grow up with each other, almost inseparable, and work together through every important stage of life. I am glad to be able to reunite with Malcolm Susan and witness him start a very different life. For example, because of my mother's careful feeding for many years, Malcolm Susan, who was only 178 in the previous life, soared to 190 in this life, and became my unattainable existence. He is free and vigorous, fresh and enthusiastic, and his brain is already good. No matter where he is placed, he is the most dazzling presence in the crowd. Mom and Dad were happy to send us to experience and learn various skills. Malcolm Susan learned basketball, riding archery, boxing, martial arts, piano, violin, guitar, painting, rock climbing. He's versatile. He's proficient in everything. I'm a master of everything. I'm not a bit of a sheet. And with Malcolm Susan, I'm finally a waste of nothing. Like last time, we started dating in college. The difference is that instead of him, he stalked me and chased me relentlessly. After I finally agreed to have a relationship with him, he happily handed the jade pendant to me like a happy puppy. Olga Pater, you are the most important person to me. He said that because of me, he finally fell in love with the world. I said, I came for you. The end.